and good to go.
Okay, great. Well, it just is wonderful to be able to welcome everyone to the monthly convening of the Charm Center's Community Engagement Core. That's the CEC in our acronym soup. And our Community Engagement Core is a part of this new Hopkins Center of Excellence in Environmental Health Sciences. It's these core centers that the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences funds. They funded these centers all across the country. And we get together. Through the pandemic, we've been getting together virtually. And we just actually, several of us came back from Houston, where we got all the chance to be back together in person. And the idea is that we want to try to build scientific capacity in the environmental health sciences. That's exposure, toxicological sciences, human health, population-based epi-sciences around pressing environmental concerns. And the NIEHS funds these regionally. So for us, Charmed is the Maryland region writ large. We're from sort of central southern PA all the way down through DC and Virginia. It's the Maryland region that we serve. And so we've been having these monthly Environmental Justice Partnership Board stakeholder meetings. We started, our first one was last year, January was our first one kicking this off. And since we started, we realized we've been focused mostly on regional air concerns, air quality. So today we're really excited to convene and shine a light on a lot of concerns around waterways, and welcoming our Riverkeeper Network partners here. And I think I'll quickly hand it over, but just one more context I think I'll set the stage is that I know that many of our partners here who are attending tonight have been working with different Hopkins Charmed members, center members, to try to elevate these issues around scientific concepts, scientific ideas that we're trying to get off the ground. And I think it's correct that it's been around this idea of the superfunds, some of the toxic exposures. And I see it's great to see Kirsten on, Dr. Kirsten Kohler, Dr. Thomas Hartung, among others. And I know also Honor Rule has been a big part of that as well. So maybe I'll set the stage there. And I chatted the agenda. We'll hand it over for introductions, maybe to Betsy, if that's okay. And then we can go down. And tonight, the idea is an initial meeting to lay out the menu, the list, the range of issues around which we could convene again in the future at an upcoming Environmental Justice Partnerships Board to do a deep dive on one of these issues and kind of set them up. And also, this meeting today is also an opportunity to make connections where there could be separate follow-up meetings in addition to the kinds that had happened around the Superfund research program planning. Okay, thanks everybody. And I know it says it in my little Hollywood square, but I am Chris Heaney, and I am a co-director of the Community Engagement Core for Charm. My counterpart, many of you might know him, who co-directs the Community Engagement Core, is Jacoby Wilson at the University of Maryland. And then we have two community co-leads. That's our structure for the Charm Center. One is the South Baltimore Community Land Trust, which had been Shoshonda Campbell, who's a big member of the Mid-Atlantic Justice Coalition. And then temporarily, we have Greg Sawtelle filling in on that role from the South Baltimore Community Land Trust. And then we have Walkiria Poole from the Centro de Apoyo Familiar, who works closely with Jacoby Wilson. So with that, I will hand it over, Betsy, and you can set the stage for our series of issues here.
Thanks, Chris. And I can say we have worked, Betsy Nicholas, Vice President of Programs for Potomac Riverkeeper Network, which the easiest way to understand that is probably advocacy, and working with the riverkeepers is my position. And really enjoyed getting to know many of the folks at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and have been working with them remotely, sort of indirectly, for a long time. And over the past year have really been collaborating on many more projects. I'm going to quickly introduce our team, so it'll just make it nice and efficient here. So we have Nancy Stoner, who is the president of Potomac Riverkeeper Network. We have Bob Dreher, who is our legal director of Potomac Riverkeeper Network. We have Dean EJPB, who is the Potomac Riverkeeper. We have Lucy Puentes, who is our new outreach coordinator. Brent Walls, the Upper Potomac Riverkeeper. And then we have some friends and allies who are here as well. We have Stacy Hartwell, who, if you don't know her, you should. She is a phenomenon. I work with her tremendously in the legislative context in Maryland. And until recently, she also served as the Justice and Climate Chair for the Maryland Conference of the NAACP. She's a resident over at National Harbor in Prince George's County. And we also have our fabulous board member, Brenda Richardson. Hi, Brenda. She has her fingers in many, many different projects, knows pretty much everyone as far as I can tell. And she is over on that little piece of the Potomac that comes around actually just a little bit above Oxen Run. And we work with her on numerous projects there. We also have Robin Broder from Waterkeepers Chesapeake. And Waterkeepers Chesapeake helps all of the different riverkeeper groups throughout the Chesapeake region work and collaborate together. And if I missed anyone from the team, please wave your hand. Okay, great. So to set the stage a little bit, one of the things that we work on very heavily at Potomac Riverkeeper Network is toxic contamination. We're focused on it from its interaction with the water, but the sources vary greatly as to how it's getting there and what it's doing. None of us on staff are public health experts. So three of the people here are lawyers by background. I also have a botany degree, so you could say, but I'm one of the lawyers. Our river keepers are extremely experienced. They know the river inside and out, the community issues, the access points, the problems, and they are just top-notch investigators digging into the issues and problems. We tend to find ourselves, because we are so based in the river in our communities, on that leading edge of issues that haven't been figured out yet, of what the problems are, what the solutions, how to deal with them. And we are often struggling to figure out what we can do to help our community to deal with these problems, regulate them, because it tends to often be on that emerging edge. Or sometimes we get the pieces that are sort of the sideline of the project, where it's fabulous that coal-fired power plants are shutting down throughout the region. But what's unacceptable is them to leave their legacy pollution in place, where it's seeping into the water, to drinking water wells, and will be there for generations to come. A lot of times we see groups sort of move on after the closure of the operations, but that's where we come in, and we're going to fight to the end to make sure that that mess is cleaned up and is not there to contaminate for the future. So I'm just going to very briefly mention a couple of the just a couple of the many legislative things we're working on. We've got some really big ones going forward in Maryland this year, including a reaction to what the Supreme Court did in the Sackett case, gutting the definition of waters of the United States, which left the fortunately very broad definition of waters of the state of Maryland untouched. But when you lose the federal authority, you lose third-party enforcement. So the only parties that can enforce state law of Maryland or state waters of the state of Maryland is the Maryland Department of the Environment, and they have done a less than stellar job to date. So this would allow that third-party enforcement under state law on any of these different contamination and pollution issues. Another one that we are working on is comprehensive coal ash legislation, based in large part on what the EPA is proposing to do. But unfortunately, through political and regulatory changes over time, we have seen that EPA good plans don't always happen. And so it's going to require monitoring, removal of the contamination, community input, payment of fees and fines by the regulated industry, but we're getting the ash out of the communities and ensuring that it doesn't contaminate their groundwater for the rest of the future. For PFAS, or forever chemicals, they are tremendously abundant. And Brent Walls, who's going to be speaking with us just in a moment, and Bob Dreher, our legal director on this issue, we are closing a couple of the loopholes right now for getting information and really trying to deal with the dischargers, the industrial dischargers that discharge into a wastewater treatment plant. They should have pre-treatment requirements. Nobody's causing that to happen. Additionally, the PFAS contaminated biosolids are being applied to the land all over the place, and there isn't even a required test them for PFAS contamination. So that will be another piece that we're working on there. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to pass it to Bob Dreher and Dean, where you'd like to chime in to talk about our first really concerning issue around Andrews Air Force Base and PFAS.
Hi, guys. So Andrews Air Force Base is in Prince George's County. Most of you guys probably know about its location, but it's in a relatively rural area that is actually the headwaters of Piscataway Creek, which flows from the base, starts on the base, originates at the foot of the runway on the base, and flows down through southern Maryland and reaches the Potomac River at the village of Piscataway, or the community of Piscataway. Like most military facilities in the United States, I think it's safe to say, Joint Base Andrews is heavily contaminated with toxic materials, including in particular PFAS. Most military installations have a long legacy of using these chemicals for firefighting foam, and using them extensively in training for putting out fires, and typically then just wash down the runways with hoses that hose them into the surface waters through drains. They also use them for other purposes on the military base, for chrome plating and for cleaning engines and things like that. But a major source of it is this firefighting foam. And as a result, Piscataway Creek is heavily contaminated with PFAS. The Maryland Department of the Environment measures PFAS levels at more than 3,000 parts per trillion in the upper part of the creek, and at more than 200 parts per trillion at the mouth of the creek. And for reference, EPA sets the proposed drinking water maximum contaminant level for PFAS is 4 parts per trillion. And they say that in part because that's the lowest that they can measure. The goal would be 0, because PFAS is carcinogenic and is very toxic. So we have a heavily contaminated creek that flows down into a community, which is largely people of color, who rely on fishing for subsistence. So there's a clear environmental justice issue here, because dietary intake of PFAS is the major pathway for exposure. Probably 85%, according to studies by the European Union, 85% of the exposure to PFAS comes through diet. And fish can have literally tens of thousands of parts per trillion of accumulated PFAS, because it bioaccumulates. And the health agencies in the United States, starting, of course, with the Food and Drug Administration, which has denied that there's any problem with PFAS in our food supply. The state of Maryland has tested a relatively small number, a fraction of the drinking water systems in Maryland for PFAS, and has only issued one fish advisory in the entire state, and that's for Piscataway Creek. And based on that fish advisory, they advise that a pregnant woman, for example, should eat bass fish caught in the creek only a few times a month. But according to the scientific evidence, a single meal of fish contaminated with PFAS at these levels is enough to raise your serum level of PFAS to dangerous levels. You can get a year's worth of exposure from eating fish several times. So no one in the government takes the pathway of exposure through fish seriously enough. Well, so that leaves us, looking at this major contamination coming off a military base, coming down into a community that is disproportionately exposed to this contamination, and agencies that are kind of washing their hands of it, at least at the moment. Part of the problem with PFAS is that these chemicals, they've relatively recently become a major concern for public health. And EPA and the state agencies are scrambling to try to establish a regulatory framework for them. EPA has in this administration, has established a roadmap for regulating PFAS under a number of different statutes, including the Safe Drinking Water Act. I mentioned that they have a proposed drinking water standard for it, which is at 4 parts per trillion. They're also proposing to regulate it as a hazardous substance under CERCLA. So EPA is trying to establish the authority to regulate this, but they are not. They're still in the proposal stage in the most important statutory frameworks. And the states are basically, Maryland in particular, is just waiting to see what EPA does and is doing nothing. So the question is, what do you do about a community that is exposed, doesn't know about it, and where the military base, I think, is clearly responsible, given the high measures of PFAS near the base. The base is a Superfund site, as many military installations are. It was contaminated. The Superfund site was established for levels of volatile organics and for PCBs, and they've largely completed the cleanup of the base for those contaminants, but they've now had to reopen the Superfund site because of the evidence of high levels of PFAS contamination at the base. So that could give us an avenue to try to work with the base to, for example, recognize that the contamination from the base extends down all the way down to the mouth of the creek, and to expand the boundaries of the Superfund site and to take responsibility for cleanup. But right now, no one's really informing the community of the risks they face, other than this fish advisory, which, as I say, is remarkably lax. So that's the challenge we face, and it's something we would love to have a plan of action to try to inform the community appropriately, and to try to engage the community and empower the community to engage with Joint Base Andrews to try to remedy the contamination that's in the creek. Dean, do you want to add to that?
Bob, I don't think I could possibly add to that. That was really great job, both you and Betsy. Great job. Yeah, I mean, just the only thing I could possibly add is just emphasizing the real issue of public fish consumption, particularly subsistence fishing, up and down this 10-mile stretch of Piscataway Creek, because people are not just fishing down near the Potomac River, but every bridge crossing. There's just cars parked and people are fishing there on a regular basis, and nobody knows about it. I mean, the state of Maryland has issued a fish consumption advisory from Piscataway Creek, but that's about it. So public notification, more data, really, really important. But I'm happy to talk about coal ash if you'd like me to move, and we'll just move through all this. And I think as far as the potential remedies go for Piscataway Creek and Andrews, we've looked into that some, but it definitely ties into sampling and public health data. So we can have a little more robust discussion about that in the Q&A if you want. But as far as coal ash goes,
Dean, let's just do a couple minutes for quick questions.
Yeah.
I
was just going to ask. I'm like, okay. Do you want to do that first? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Somebody else. Stacy, please.
Hi, sorry. Have you made any outreach, or has there been any outreach to like the legislature, the local governments impacted by this, by some of the communities there?
Yes. We haven't come up with anything a lot more direct. I have not reached out to anyone at the base yet. I have talked to some legislators and some council people in Prince George's County, and they've expressed concern, but there seems to be a lack of clarity on what to do with that concern. Bob, I don't know if you had more to add there.
No, except to say that, of course, the problem, we're focusing on Joint Base Andrews in part because it flows into our Potomac watershed, but the problem is much bigger than Joint Base Andrews. There's, for example, 9 military facilities other than Joint Base Andrews that are contaminating Chesapeake Bay with PFAS. So it's a statewide concern, and I think, as I say, I think the state government is still waiting to see what's going to happen with EPA's approach to regulation.
And I think that's part of the big problem here is that you have fish consumption, and EPA is focused on a drinking water standard they can't seem to get done. And yet it seems like any issues to address fish consumption are a long way off. To answer your question, Stacy, and hello, when we do this research, our investigations that Betsy talked about, it's part of our assessment stage, and we need to. Sometimes this stuff takes years for us to figure out. So the answer to your question is not much, no. But there's a reason, and there's a challenge with DoD and Superfund sites that are different. And I don't want to get into wonky details, but they're very reluctant to push and do the public process that would normally happen under a normal. So I've worked on Superfund sites in North Carolina that had a whole robust, there was money for your own scientists and to engage the community. It's called a technical assistant grant, and it's for that purpose. DoD has not done that. They should be doing it, but their feet are really going to be need to held to the fire. But we can only do that with good, strong data, and we're still, I think, in that collection phase. So I hope that's helpful. It's not that we ever wanted to, but plus we have a million other irons in the fire you're getting ready to hear about. So.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dean. Your audio is getting a little muffled there at the end. I don't know if it was for anybody else or just me. I had one question, which is you mentioned that you're highlighting the importance of seafood, or I'm guessing shellfish consumption in this. What's the extent of testing that's occurred? I'm wondering in the Chesapeake Bay region about oysters. Has any of that work been done, and by whom? And has there been analysis for PFAS in different kinds of seafood products around the region?
I don't know the answer about shellfish. Our concern actually is focused more on freshwater fish. There's a paper done earlier this year in environmental science by scientists from the Environmental Working Group that examines the levels of PFAS contamination freshwater fish nationwide using databases compiled by EPA and by the states. And that's a very valuable resource, and it lays out, it extrapolates from the levels of PFAS found to the likely impact on blood serum for individuals. So it's really the best, I think, that I've seen that traces this through. And their conclusion basically is that eating a single freshwater fish can raise your blood serum levels to above to like the 75th or 90th percentile levels of what they measure in human beings. The levels that are found in commercial fish, particularly ocean fish, are much lower, 78 times lower than is found in freshwater fish. So it's really freshwater fish that are being exposed to this chemical runoff into our freshwater streams.
And what about clams?
There's only been a few fish tested in Piscataway Creek that led to the MDE fish consumption advisory. But there's very limited data. We need more data.
Okay.
USGS is doing some testing. As of yet, they have not focused on the shellfish yet. Most of their PFAS testing has been organs of fish, and maybe some people eat fish organs, but usually it's the tissue. So there's a lack there. And I recently asked Attorney General Brown and then MDE what they plan to do about this, and they felt like fish consumption advisories was what they plan to do.
Yeah, they should be doing that at the very least. But just so everybody knows, Piscataway Creek and this portion of the Potomac River is fresh water tidal. There's no salt, there's no shellfish, so just stuff like that.
I think Kirsten had a question in the chat about how is the advisory being disseminated out to the community or public?
If somebody can find it on the MDE website, send it to me.
Yeah, it's on the MDE website. So, most of the people who are fishing, that's where they go before they go fishing. Yeah.
Sorry if I sound a little jaded. I apologize.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I
They could be
don't
doing a
think
lot
there's
more.
anything like signs or anything that tell people.
No, there are no signs.
No.
Sorry, I should have clarified that. Sorry about that. Yeah, no signs at all.
Dean actually lives in Piscataway, so
I
he's
live
pretty-
on Piscataway Creek.
Mhm.
I see it every day.
Should we
So
Well,
move
actually,
on? Oh,
let me just
sorry.
say,
Good.
among the strategies that we're thinking about is, for example, trying to get the ATSDR to petitioning the ATSDR to come in and do human blood and tissue sampling to try to establish whether the community there has been significantly affected, that sort of thing, as well as trying to engage the Defense Department to see if we can get remedies under Superfund.
or possibly RECRA case. I don't know that, but
Yeah.
But and then we thought some surveys of people doing subsisting fishing along various boat ramps and bridge crossings, if they're willing to talk, could be some really useful data, like how many fish are you eating per week? Are you feeding these to your children? That sort of information.
So have they looked at any mercury levels? No.
Not that I'm aware of. I think Pat Elder with a group like ours that goes after military pollution all across the country. He got some money for some basic fish testing. I've done some fish testing in North Carolina, and it's usually like $1,000 a fish. It's really hard for groups like ours to come up with much money, but it was enough apparently to satisfy the concerns of MDE and certainly probably public health to justify listing a fish consumption advisory.
Yeah, I think there's a general fish consumption advisory for the entire state of Maryland when it comes to mercury.
Yes,
so there's just
it's been around for a while.
yeah, it's been out for quite a long time. So there's a recommendation level. Again, though, those advisories are not posted at all of these locations where people actually are fishing. There are sometimes as a notification, hey, here's a link, or go to such and such website to look at fish consumption advisories, but no one's going to do that, and not unless it's right there in front of them.
Yeah.
Quick question here from a newbie, Ethan McMahon, former EPA, but mostly I worked on air, climate, and open data issues. But I was there for 27 years, and some of the water stuff rubbed off on me a bit, especially working with water data, and the lack thereof. Just curious about if USGS is testing on organs, maybe there's some way of modeling how that conveys to fish tissue or something like that. How do we use the existing data to still help? And if ATSDR is, I guess they could do human sampling, but that's expensive. Another thought is if it costs $1,000 to test a single fish, and it's hard to know if that fish would be representative and so on, and that's kind of a big heavy lift for us. What are other, aside from legal venues, which sound like smart ideas, does it make sense for us to put up signs?
Yeah.
That could cost, $20 a sign, and you put them up, and the most, if we're trying to reduce risk,
Yeah.
we could put that up, put little QR codes that link to the online thing and say, per MDE, and for, we could put them up in 20 places for, a few $100, I guess. I don't know. I think it sounds like you have to hit it. I'm not used to working on area issues like this, where there's not that much data. So it sounds like you have to just kind of do an all hands on deck sort of throughout the whole life cycle of I can't remember what it's called. It's like the risk management framework, or other frameworks. At every point, you still try to have some kind of impact.
Yeah,
Just some initial.
for sure.
Yeah. I'll
I mean-
I'll just say this. I'm sorry, Dean. Go ahead.
No, you go.
No, I was just going to say this. I think you're absolutely right. And we share your concern. We share the fact that fish consumption and fish testing is at the lowest platform when it comes to the state agencies' involvement. Obviously, highest priority has been drinking water. We have been at the forefront of pushing the state of Maryland and other states, West Virginia included, now Virginia, to do more with wastewater treatment plants because they're a source, let alone industrial sites, and now biosolids, which I'll get into, down the here in a little bit. And then, fish consumption advisors is just a huge component that we're really, really concerned about, and we're trying to formulate a process on how we can attack it. And so all these are great ideas, and we're just continuing to work with USGS and other institutions as we start to grow that information.
And as I said, I think the big picture that we can't solve everything, but if we can try to raise awareness of this, big picture is that the EPA is focused on drinking water, which is perhaps 10% of human exposure to PFAS. There is no federal standard for fish tissue consumption. And USDA denies that PFAS is in our food supply, which is just literally putting their head in the sand. So what we are trying to do is to call attention to the incredibly important pathway of food, particularly freshwater fish, in this, because that, I think, is much more significant for human health right now than even drinking water. Although it's commendable that we're going after drinking water. So that's. We've thought about community meetings once, when we're ready to present, and try to engage the community. I think posting signs could scare people. I mean, maybe that's a good outcome if it scares them away from me. But for a lot of the folks that eat fish regularly, they don't have a good alternative supply because they eat it as a subsistence matter, and it's cheap, and they can't afford to buy fish from the grocery store. So figuring out how we can talk through these issues with the community, and then how we can empower them to engage with the military is what we're focused on.
But yeah, like basic information on fact sheets, and getting to Stacy's question a while ago, like even getting help from a public health expert like yourselves to put together maybe even a letter so that a local lawmaker could get the local public health department to say, hey, this is a concern. We need signs up here for our local citizens using this resource.
Yeah.
The local public health department has to then reach out to the state public health department, MDE, and there's a lot of conversations that need to happen. And I've been part of that in North Carolina. There's a lot of politics just to even get signs up, and there's often no money for it, but that could happen. And that's actually a really good start just to get like this campaign going that could lead to more of the larger funding that Bob is talking, that we were talking about down the road, but it has to start somewhere. And that is really helpful, maybe a first starting point. Because it's a public health issue.
Yeah, bring up Chris's point in the chat. We have a group within our department, Center for Livable Future, who works on food exclusively. They've worked on seafood at different areas and safety issues around seafood. So we might be able to loop them into this and use some of their experience and protocols for dissemination of this kind of information. They have done measurement of metals in gardening soils and advised people on whether they should be gardening in their yards and backyards, etc., based on the levels of metals that are present. Ironically, I was just reviewing a student's grant proposal today, and her proposal is to work she's an engineer, to create a mitigation strategy for removing PFAS from biosoils. So, maybe there's a natural kind of fit here because she didn't have a population or a location that she was thinking
Wait
of
till you hear from Brent Walls.
so yeah,
You're gonna learn
exactly.
a lot, Brent.
So yeah, it'd be very
So-
interesting. But one thing I learned from Heron, I'll just share that with you when you were talking about where's most of the PFAS found. I'm not sure that we know. We need to actually determine that. But her premise was that even if it's in the water and it's not being caught during the water purification step, it's going to water all the soils. And so it's broadly contaminating soils, not only fishing, but soils used for, food production, et cetera. So we need to do some strategic sampling to see what is the distribution. And many of these different media, whether it's water, lake streams or soils, to start to get a feeling for this and thinking about that all plays into mitigation strategies. It's going to be much harder to mitigate large fields and soil distribution, but might be more effective to treat bioswales as they're coming through the treatment plants. But I don't think there's a tried and true mitigation strategy yet, to be honest.
To Marcia's point, this was actually our third topic, but I'm wondering if we could just flip them, if that's okay with
I
you.
wondered the same, Betsy. If we could go on the PFAS theme and do Brent with PFAS and biosolids and then come back, Dean. Is that okay to Kailash?
Sure.
All right. I think you are up, Brent.
All right, so let me share my screen and I will I'll work backwards and we're gonna go with presentation. Come on. So
that looks good.
All right, so I'm going to kick it off with PFAS portion of my PowerPoint. And so what this is this is a map that I created of all the active land, active permits for biosolid application on farm fields. So all the red dots are locations that are current actively spreading biosolids coming from wastewater treatment plants. Mostly, and a lot of, and there's not one particular wastewater treatment plant that's supplying. It's just a combination of many wastewater treatment plants. And the black pins are we have data for each one of the counties for historical. So there's a lot of historical farmland that have had biosolids placed on them over the years. They may not be active anymore, but they have had that. So there's a historical nature there that we didn't really able to pinpoint each one of those, but we do have it calculated out as to how many are in each of those areas. And why that is that important is because PFAS has been around since the late 60s, and it's gotten into our products in the 70s. Throughout the 80s and 90s. And so PFAS has been in our wastewater and our waste stream for quite a long time. And we're really concerned about biosolids on these farm fields for a number of reasons. It's not only getting into our food sources. So a lot of these farms can grow corn, they can grow hay, and they can graze cattle after a certain period of time that the biosolids have been spread. Well, that corn that's grown is feed corn. That feed corn can go to cows and chickens and other things. And there has been research that shows that PFAS can be uptaken from the soils into corn and then passed through into the animal. But particularly it's the hay and the grazing. So the hay production, that hay production is given to horses, which we're not consuming in this country, but hay is also given to cattle and other animals. So it's there's that transference, and then obviously direct grazing from milking cows, beef cows on those same farmlands where biosolids have been spread on. So that's a concern of how this is getting directly into the food systems, but it's also concern of getting into our groundwater because it does leach and moves quite easily through ground media. It doesn't get absorbed by the ground. It doesn't get broken down like a lot of other constituents in the ground media. And so it's very persistent and it flows. And especially in some parts of our state where the red circle is, I wanted to highlight that in Frederick County, there's a number of biosolid active permits. And what's interesting is the next slide, you'll see that this is public drinking water sampling that was done by MDE in the last year or so. And all the red dots are where the levels have violated the MDE's levels of PFAS. Now it's that was pre the EPA's suggested drinking water guidance of 4 parts per trillion. So they haven't gone back to readjust any of those levels, but at this time, those violations were quite a bit. And what's interesting is if you go back and forth, there's that cluster of active biosolid permits in that same exact area where you have public drinking water wells that are fed by groundwater. And so, it's a concern for us because we want to be able to understand what's going on with this. And we also want to be able to come up with ways that is not going to impact the farms. There is a beneficial use of biosolids, but at the same time, we really have to be protective of our food sources and of our farmers and their way of life. And so, trying to not just determine what shouldn't go on the ground, but then how do we help the farmers achieve, their economic ability to survive and maintain what it is that they do for us. And then continuing on, so we do a lot of projects, and a lot of these projects are is in that assessment field. We're trying to assess a particular issue, a toxic issue, and we have plans to do a PFAS study in the state of Maryland, in the Potomac watershed. And all of these dots right here represent USGS gauge stations. And all these gauge stations, we are planning on collecting PFAS samples at each one of these. And one of the bottom dots down there below Alexandria is Piscataway Creek. And we know that it has a known PFAS issue. We know that it has a known fish consumption advisory, but we want to compare the loading of PFAS in that stream, Piscataway Creek, with many of the other rivers and streams in the Potomac watershed, to develop a roadmap as to where we should start addressing PFAS and fish consumption advisories and start looking at sources and starting to turn off those sources. This is something that the state hasn't been doing. It's not on their roadmap. They're focused on drinking water. They're focused on assessing wastewater treatment plants and maybe concerning themselves with biosolids, but they're not looking at fish consumption advisories. And this is one way that we can start to attack that issue. And you overlay DEIJ issues, and you have a lot of low income or in the tanned, various different colored tanned areas, and you see there's more low income areas in the upper Potomac, and then we have a lot of racial demographics down in the DC area. And so you can see where the dots that we're sampling is a pretty good mix between environmental justice communities, whether it's low income or whatnot. And so we feel that it's a really good project for us to get involved with, and this is part of our assessment process. And so that's the PFAS. I do a lot of talks and conversations. I've been working on PFAS issues for since 2016, and so I've researched the heck out of this subject, and I can just about answer any questions that you have on PFAS. But essentially, there's a cycle, and we need to stop that cycle. And the only way that we need to stop that cycle is by starting to turn off the sources. And I was reminded recently of the PCBs are still a thing. They're still out there. They're still a problem. And I talked to a researcher who's been researching PCBs for 30 years. So PCBs have been considered a toxic pollutant for 30 years, and they still have been able to remove all the PCBs in our waterways. And PFAS is much more lucrative, much more persistent, and everywhere than what PCBs are. PCBs you can take out of the soils and remove the PCB, and the problem is virtually fixed. PFAS, it's not that way. But until we start turning off these sources, we're never going to get ahead of the game. So I can take questions on PFAS, or we can move into coal ash. I have a number of other slides on two subject areas, acid mine drainage and coal ash, which the only thing I was going to talk about coal ash, since Dean is our resident expert on coal ash, I do employ a number of different investigation techniques to be able to investigate these coal ash dump sites that are all throughout our watershed.
Mhm. So looking at your distribution there, it does look like it's farming or biosolids and things. Doesn't look like it's just, groundwater per se. Or the PFAS.
Meaning that the impact of to groundwater. I mean, so we have runoff from the farm fields that get into our rivers and streams. So that's a big concern.
Uh-huh. But just the distribution according to your dots, it seems to be higher concentrations in those areas where they deposited biosolids or farming or other kinds of activities.
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. I mean, you can see the Eastern Shore has a number of dots. We have the lower southern Maryland, and then kind of like mid part of Western Maryland, but not so much in the middle section of Maryland around DC area. Yeah, you're right. So it is definitely the rural communities. It's the farming communities that are being inundated with the biosolids. And in going to the map where there's, let's see, where do I have it? No, I don't have it. There it is. So we can look at the low income. This is 2020 data, 2020 census data, and so you can see where we have a lot of lower income in the upper part of the watershed, and also down in the southern part of the watershed as well. I didn't include Maryland or further beyond. We were just focused on the Potomac in this particular.
So I don't know what people's backgrounds on the call, but we do have a hydrologist as one of our faculty members who does this kind of tracing or aging of water, rivers, streams, etc. So when we were talking with you guys initially about the Superfund project, knowing the right place to sample many of these things, he might be able to help us with that, knowing the flows, distributions, etc. of the waterways. So I can ask him to join our next conversation. He might be able to be helpful in that regard, because you're talking about a pretty massive area here.
Oh yeah, agreed. And you're absolutely right. I think that would be a fabulous asset to to work with. There is a number of groundwater monitoring wells throughout the state of Maryland, but the majority of them are in southern Maryland and Eastern Shore, so the coastal part of the water of the state, and not so many, very few in fact, in the western part of Maryland, where there still is a significant number of PFAS issues and applications of biosolids. And a number of groundwater wells. And then we also have karst geology in the Washington County and Frederick County area that is an easy conduit to get into our groundwater, into our private wells out here.
Yeah, that's the other thing that we hadn't discussed, is that there are a lot of people that actually, when I lived just slightly out of the city limits on the north of Baltimore, had a private well. So there's, and certainly these things are not monitored.
No, and I live right in the Hagerstown, Williamsport area, and there is a recent study through University of Maryland to have private wells tested for various different pollutants, and PFAS is one of them. And I signed up my well to get tested, so I'm very interested in that. But that's something that we need to try and spread the news and try and get people interested. But the test for PFAS can be quite expensive, and that's something we're always looking at, is trying to work with other universities that have those lab capabilities where we can give lower cost testing to low income families to really know what's in their water.
We do have those capabilities. That we have environmental chemists who do a lot of these kind of measurements. They're not running them on a large scale, but they certainly could, do some testing. And if there was a need and if we could seek other funding, we could probably do it on a larger scale.
Sure.
We did propose it in the Superfund. There would be a core that would do those samples.
Mhm.
So if we're lucky enough to get funded, that could be a source of funds to run that lab and do various studies with people.
Right.
Yeah. So coal ash, you wanted to tell us?
Just wanted to add one thing to Brent has done, just, through patching together resources here and there, some sampling in a number of places. And I mean, this is not shocking information, but the issue with the biosolids, you're just concentrating it.
Yes.
And then when you're land applying it, and working with our Baltimore Harbor waterkeeper as well, it was sort of fascinating. She knew Brent mapped all of this, but knew the locations of some of the Baltimore area wastewater treatment plants where their solids were going. And so we could actually see the direct connection between some of the PFAS levels and the waste coming from cities like Baltimore and DC, and see it going out there, but yet we don't have all the tools we need to stop it or treat it or do any of those things. So it's very frustrating to have that piece of information, but not being able to get it more widely disseminated, studied, understood, and certainly regulated and stopped.
Yeah. And I think the ultimate goal here, and this is going to be down the line because this is going to be extremely expensive, and we need to develop a process to upgrade all of our wastewater treatment plants, not just to remove PFAS, but to break PFAS, to break those bonds and break it down so that biosolids could be utilized, because it is a resource that we don't want to be landfilling biosolids for here on out forever. We want to be able to utilize it in some form or some fashion, but we have to make sure that those biosolids aren't going to contaminate our farm fields and contaminate our food sources. And so that's really where I see things ultimately going, is not just removing, but breaking the bonds. And there is a technology out there right now that does do just that. And so, and then there's other technology out there right now that's looked at as, looking at historical croplands that have PFAS levels in the soils, and hemp is one of them, where they can grow the hemp and it uptakes the PFAS in the soils, and then it's after a period of time, those soils can then be returned back to food production. So there are definitely some methodologies and that we need to employ, but it's just going to take some time and some advocacy.
They're expensive, but also we call PFAS a forever chemical for a reason, because it's not that easy to degrade it.
Right.
And it's just really removal. It's like with the metals. They're not going anywhere. You're just moving them from one place to another. Or you're binding them up and making them a little less active. But well, hopefully somebody can come up with some really effective means of degrading PFAS. But
well, I think Marcia just gave a perfect connection to our next little set of topics that are also interrelated there, with the metals and acid mine drainage and coal ash. And Dean, did you want to go first on your coal ash, or should we just stick with Brent to go for a couple minutes here with his slideshow?
Well, I have coal ash slides, and I'll just briefly talk, and I can leave that on one of the slides, and Dean can go take it from there. Really, what like I said, Dean is the expert on coal ash. He's been in the thick of it, and he's had a number of wins outside of our watershed, inside our watershed. So he is definitely the man with coal ash. I am helping the organization and Dean to do the investigation of a number of different coal ash dumps that are scattered throughout the state and throughout our watershed. And this process essentially is going to each one of these locations and looking for features and characteristics and assessing the priority of that dump site, and to figure out if that dump site, if that coal ash is what priority does it have in the removal process or the recycling process. And so this is just one example of a coal ash site assessment that I was doing in the upper part of the watershed, and this is Western Port, Maryland. Many of you may have known that's where Luke Paper Mill was, and so this is the coal ash dump for Luke Paper Mill and some other coal ash locations in that area, but mostly it was the Luke Mill. So I'm flying a drone right now, and I'm flying over the coal ash dump that has layers of grass that covered over it. And if you look at Google Earth at this location, which I don't have those particular slides, but I have a whole another 20-minute PowerPoint on that, that shows the progression of coal ash being dumped at this site over the years, over the past 20 years. And but as we move closer to the end of this coal ash pile, you can start to see where they are removing that coal ash. And they're removing that coal ash little bit by little bit and taking it to a recycling cement plant. So they're already doing some recycling here, but there are some problematic issues for this particular site. And as we get in closer, you can see the runoff potential from the digging, from the expedition that they're taking out of the ground and into the trucks. But you can see the erosion, and the erosion continues on. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but it continues on in a pathway down into this bottom upper part of the valley here. And it's going from this one side to the other side, and it's getting into drainage pathways, which then flow into river streams, which then flows into the Potomac, upper North Branch Potomac. And, so this is a classic site where there are very little pollution controls occurring on site as they are removing this coal ash. And to us, that is a significant problem. Yay to them that they're recycling the coal ash on a very, very small scale, it seems like. But they're not setting up those controls to manage any runoff coming off from the site. Here's another issue that is coming up. There's a lot of surface mines out there, where they've excavated coal over the years. This is Cabin Run up in the North Branch, near just south of Cumberland, actually. But you can see some of the dark black lines on some of the edges of this stream, of this big coal pit. And that's where they're dumping coal ash. So they're like filling in this void with coal ash. And that bottom water down there is groundwater. That bottom water is, connected to a number of different aquifers throughout the area. And to us, this is just wrong. It's a wrong practice to dump this coal ash into this great big huge pit that we don't know what future problems are going to be down the road. And so this is another one of the sites that we're investigating, and there are at least 20 or 30 sites across our watershed that we'll be looking at in closer detail. And I didn't know if you wanted to talk more, Dean, about coal ash, but that's our investigation process. And one of the things that we're going to be looking at with this is private wells, contamination of surface water, contamination of groundwater, proximity to environmental justice communities, because we do have a number of these locations in environmental justice areas in the southern part of our watershed. So it's not just in the upper Potomac where mining typically is, it's in a lot of locations. So Dean, did you want to speak to anything, or I can answer any questions on our investigation techniques?
Yeah. One of the most important things I heard today was from Bob. He told me that on EPA's, I guess, enforcement website, they said that they've elevated coal ash and coal ash enforcement in terms of like closures, and PFAS as the top two priority issues that EPA is going to be working on.
Yeah.
And so I've been working on coal ash for 10 years. I was involved with the Dan River spill in North Carolina. I was a riverkeeper there for 14 years. And, we had coal ash ponds on the Yadkin River, and, basically the communities that lived around these ponds. And I have a whole presentation. I would love to show you all my coal ash slides. But in the interest of time, we can't do that. And Betsy told me because I just got a surgery, I didn't need a presentation. So thank you, Brent, and others for covering for me. But it's just basically these communities that live near these, all of these ash ponds, big picture, are unlined almost all around the country. And you're putting, 4 and 5 up to 20 million tons of coal ash, and it's leaking not only into waterways. These dissolved metals are passing through into people's drinking wells. And the issue we've been dealing with at Possum Point in Virginia, they've been monitoring groundwater monitoring for 30 years, and they've known that there's no groundwater contamination, but there's just hasn't been these triggers. And it's just kind of wild when you think about that. Only 10 years ago, really, did we start actually dealing with coal ash for the first time ever. And yet there's millions and hundreds of millions of tons of it all throughout the United States that we know of. And then we just had some research from the Maryland Power Plant program that Betsy could talk at length about. This guy, Jason, with Frostburg University, did all this LiDAR imaging. Now they're finding hundreds of millions of more tons of coal ash storage areas using LiDAR imaging all over. And so it's a huge public health issue. I think the good thing about it is it doesn't seem as, I hate to say this, futile as like the PFAS issue, where it's just everywhere and it's just coming from so many sources. There's actually often limited places where it's at, and it can be recycled. Mm-hmm. And there's all these movements toward recycling ash. And I think, honestly, we have all these leaking coal ash landfills in African-American communities right here, Prince George's County, that are leaking and causing all this contamination. We don't know about drinking well contamination. We haven't really sampled any of that. But at the end of the day, we need scientific data. We need money for sampling, as Brent was talking about, to kind of show where these sources of contamination are coming from. Sometimes it leads to a lawsuit, and we sue. That's how I won in North Carolina, actually forcing Duke Energy to clean up 5 million tons of ash and recycling all of it on site as part of the settlement agreement. So, we've had some successes. There's opportunities to do a lot more, and that's something Betsy is going to be working on to talk about in terms of some of the legislation. But in the interest of time, I know we're here to talk about public health, so I'll just stop it there.
So I wanted to ask my colleagues, looking at those pools of water, we have some open pit pictures like that in Baltimore where they were doing utility work, and that color looks like chromium. But I don't know.
Brent, can you toggle back to the open groundwater pool pond here? Yes.
I mean, it could be other things, but chromium does have that kind of yellow color.
Yeah. Often at these sites, they have the coal ash ponds, and then they have what's called metals ponds.
Okay.
And so at Possum Point, they had 5 coal ash ponds, 5 million tons of ash. And I was asking DEQ, like, hey, well, what's in these metals ponds? And they really had no idea. I mean, even coal ash ponds have boiler slag and all sorts of other stuff, but there's well over 32 metals. Even radium-226 is in coal ash. I mean, it's just, really dangerous. And then it's almost like you put it in this giant, the ash pond at Possum Point is 92 feet deep, and it holds 4.5 million tons of ash. And they're building tons and tons of houses, brand new houses, $500,000, $1 million homes right next to where they want to landfill this 4.5 million tons of ash and where it's currently sitting. It's kind of mind blowing. It could become a really hot issue. And just recently, and this is where the research coming in is really important. We worked with Mary Washington College, just did a report on, some of the sediment, fish tissue analysis in Quantico Creek next to the coal ash pond, showing that there was a connection to coal ash contamination and the impacts from all those heavy metals that were leaching into Quantico Creek. So that report just came out, and I've been working on that issue since 2015. So, that's like research I could have used years ago, but it's it is coming in very helpful right now that we hope to use to kind of leverage kind of cleanup efforts and recycling and that sort of stuff. So
Well, you could stage a public information and hopefully people would hear about it and not buy those.
hey, we are going to do that actually.
Yes.
Yes, we are going to do that for
I
sure.
mean, if somebody told me that, I don't think I would buy a house in that area. But then again, most of us on the call are a little more in tune with the harm that can be caused by these things. But that does look very similar to this chromium pond that we have a picture of, but it could be other things. But now that you say that they're called metal ponds, then there probably is a whole host of toxic metals there.
And it's definitely hexavalent chromium and coal ash.
Oh yes, okay.
It makes you want to get a picture of that and
Yes.
bring it to meetings. Like, hey, would anyone like a sip of this water?
Yeah, exactly.
And
tell them about lung cancer and other things that chromium causes.
I don't know if you heard in North Carolina in 2015, they sampled every drinking well within 1 mile or half mile of 14 coal ash power plant sites from one end of the state to the other. 390 wells, 363, I believe, were contaminated with hexavalent chromium, vanadium, other metals, some different, and they were issued do not drink advisories by the state public health department. So that should just give you an indication of known, like, not just a microcosm. Like Indiana has 85 coal ash ponds. North Carolina had 32. There's a lot of coal ash in other states that's not even being addressed. And what's scary is these EPA rules came into effect in 2015, but it basically gives these utilities only a 15-year window to close these ash ponds. And so all over the country, they're closing these ash ponds. And these state agencies and these rules are not federal rules like the Clean Water Act that for other issues, they're basically delegated down to the states and where these utilities just have a lot of influence. And so then the state agencies are not really issuing or requiring adequate corrective action and cleanup for these coal ash ponds. It's just terrible. And they're literally poisoning communities, poisoning our rivers. And a lot of them they're closing without any type of liner system at all, just like, closing what it's called cap in place. It's just terrible. It's ridiculous. So anyway, I could go on.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll over time, way over time.
Actually, we're on schedule. We got till
Okay,
7:30.
good.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just trying to rush. I apologize.
One of the things that we want to try to facilitate broadly through CHARM, but also through these monthly EJ partnership board meetings is just, connections and opportunities for us to learn on the CHARM side from community about the problems, and then think of ways we might be able to strategically team up. And so I don't know, Marcia, would it be possible to maybe share with the group a little bit? Because wasn't there some teaming up and some preliminary data collection as a part of the Superfund process, looking at metals and things? I don't know if everybody knows all about that, or maybe as a possible starting point for maybe what we could also facilitate in CHARMed.
I mean, many people on this call, I think, were part of the Superfund application. So I think there is a intention to help look at some of the coal ash and metals and PFAS and other things that are in there. So if, the one downside is that such a large program that it takes like 1.5 years to get the grants reviewed. So it's going to be a long time before we find out. But the focus was on the impacts of metals, in particular, chromium, cadmium, arsenic, and Kirsten, what was the last one? I'm forgetting. As sort of the top interactive profile of metals that have the largest risk to human health. Metals, as well as their interactions with PFAS and other OH PFAS derivatives. looking at the interactions. That project, as many of you know, has to have a remediation strategy. And this is why I was talking about the PFAS earlier. It's doubtful we're going to have very efficient mechanisms for destroying it or degrading it. So binding it up, changing its charge and things like this are the ways that we have to go about it. And that's same thing with the metals. They're not going anywhere. They're here forever, right? So the question is, are they in the harmful form like hexavalent versus the trivalent chromium? Oddly enough, the Chrome 3 is actually a dietary requirement for humans, but the hexavalent form is very toxic. So if you find these things and you put them in the right milieu with the right charge, other minerals, other organics that may kind of keep them in check, right? And prevent them from being distributed and being active. So that was one of the mitigation remediation strategies we have, is to try to understand how those things, because they're not found in isolation. You know, like you said here, it's a metals pond. There's probably multiple types of metals there. And they all have different chemistries, and you have to understand what the mixture, how the mixture behaves in order to really put in the proper amendments, soil amendments to mitigate those activities. So that if we get that funded, we will have lots of opportunities for doing this kind of work. Unlike Charmed, which is more small little projects, the Superfund is all the money will go to those kinds of studies. So we are able to do it, and we have a lab. Anna Rule and Karsten, who's not with us tonight, run PFAS and various metal assays for us. We have great capabilities in that regard. And we have a lot of people on the call that do human epidemiology and human assessment studies to look to see what, the consequences to humans. But Chris, you might mention the thing that's coming up on the 14th, where small amount of data has gone a long way towards getting some attention from the state.
Yeah, and I think that's what we can do, find strategic alignment, strategic connections where faculty and Charmed are, working on topics in spaces, and and that's the whole idea of Charmed and getting together around a meeting like this to try to align. And since the beginning of Charmed, we've been doing that with partners in South Baltimore and Curtis Bay. And what Marcia mentioned is an upcoming Community of Curtis Bay public meeting on December 14th. And I think if you're on the Charmed email list, which I think everybody on here is, we sent out a notice about that meeting in Curtis Bay at the Recreation Center there on December 14th in the evening. It's actually going to be the next convening of our Environmental Justice Partnerships Board. We're going to bring Charmed to that meeting, where the community is going to reveal collaborative data that we've been collecting with Charmed, us, and with MDE and the University of Maryland, Jacoby Wilson and other air scientists there, that speak to the concerns of a different form of coal, the open air coal terminal there, with a lot of the fugitive dust and runoff kind of concerns related to coal transport, from the mines and the Virginias down to the harbor in Baltimore, and then exported all over the world. So yeah, that's something that is an example. Good, thanks for pointing that out, Marcia, where we think we can, when we team up, we think we can help bring some small but maybe meaningful preliminary data to the table, and also provide some of that scientific capacity around what we already know, we can say around an environmental or a public health topic. So this is just hopefully what we're growing here is around these issues, opportunities for connections like that to happen.
So Chris, you might Do you or Maddie have handy the pictures of the coal dust on the homes and the electron microscopy?
Oh, Maddie, that might be for on your
Maddie,
side.
do you
I know
have
you're
that?
flipping that.
I mean, the homes that are, what, 100 yards, less than 100 yards from these huge coal piles are just covered in black soot. And, you just rub your fingers and it's all in the houses. It's, it's just awful. But a meeting, who was the woman? Was she the new environmental secretary?
Yeah, I think it gets at this data need, the data gaps, where the incoming governor Wes Moore and their administration and the appointees was the Secretary of the Environment, came to Curtis Bay for one of their environmental justice listening sessions, and was trying to acknowledge the around the residents' concerns, trying to really acknowledge an awareness of it, and simply stating, and it was a public meeting that was recorded, that everybody knows it's coal dust, right? But then sort of when push comes to shove, and there's sort of what data backs that up, and there is no data to actually back that up, it kind of has to moderate that statement and pause it until data are available. So that's kind of an example of what we can do in Charmed, is try to think of where something might be patently obvious, but there's just not data, right, to really help provide that catalyst around a community strategy to try to improve environmental protection and public health protection.
So I think she said, Chris, and maybe this was not exactly how it went, but she said everybody knows it's coal dust, but prove it. So that's what you guys did.
Yeah, and it's
well, and that just reminded me of one other bill I didn't mention. I had a couple of years ago worked with some other advocates to get environmental justice screening required for all new and reissued permits, and that's on part of the public notice. MDE has been doing that. They were cooperative to that. They did not fight that legislation. The problem is they don't believe they have the authority to do anything about it. And so that is another bill we're working on for this upcoming session. I don't have a very good sense of what the chances are. It's been trimmed down a little bit to be a little more focused, but if we're looking at awareness of the impacts and yet they still feel that they're compelled, I'm saying it that way because I would disagree legally that they don't have any authority, but that's not my disagreement isn't going to convince them to do it. But making it clear that they do have the authority to deny permits based on environmental justice impacts that are unacceptable. And it's a huge priority to fix this, because it doesn't do any good to know about the impacts if we're not going to do anything about fixing it.
Yeah, I think, when the train derailment in Ohio occurred and they wanted to ship the contaminated water, the governor actually tried to stop it. But then it turns out that the feds, probably EPA, told them it wasn't their jurisdiction. Yeah. Because it's interstate commerce and not strictly a Maryland issue. So that kind of thing is incredibly frustrating. So that might be some of the issues or things they're running into with pushback, but that's being generous to them to perhaps explain why, they're making some of the decisions they are. But
and just to what you were saying, not just about data, but different ways to look at and analyze the data. We're frustrated about knowing about all of these toxins and the exposure pathways, and feel like the laws are not helping us, at least not in the way that they were designed to. So that sort of creative exploration of what else can we use? What are the other ways we can approach this issue to be able to really affect change? And I think some of that public health data could be an avenue.
Yeah, I definitely agree. But another avenue, you know, the state is highly dependent on seafood industry, food industry. And, you know, if you can go at it, you know, at a ploy to suggest that it's unsafe. And that could have a huge economic impact, and they would probably push back pretty hard. But at the same time, you know, they might pay more attention about cleaning up things. But
we're okay with pushback. Bob can tell you. We're suing the Navy right now.
Yeah,
so.
well, I mean, we all have to be ready for that, because that's what will happen with these big industries for sure. But anyway, didn't mean to derail the conversations.
Yeah. No, but one of the things I know we want to do is we just are really good. Let's be sensitive to everyone's time. But I want to make sure that if we want to have an opportunity for any connections to be made that maybe aren't already occurring, Betsy, Dean, Bob, Brent, what are the kinds of connections? Can we just recap, like for forward-looking steps, you know, as Charmed, what are the kinds of you know, meetings you could imagine wanting to be able to set up to try to make connections? Sounds like we have CLF, maybe with the food angle, to think about if there's educational dissemination or kind of knowledge that we can kind of summarize there. But what are some of the other kinds of things?
I think it would be very helpful to have a community meeting near Piscataway Creek, near Andrews Air Force Base, perhaps invite somebody from the base and have some of your folks attend, so that we do have that sort of gravitas of Johns Hopkins School of Public Health there. I think it will be harder for them to refuse the invitation. And come and talk to the community, face them. Face the people whose water and fish you've contaminated. I think that would be one.
Okay,
So,
that's great. And Dean,
can I just ask one quick question about that? When I was looking at the official Superfund sites in the Maryland region, one is at that base, right?
Yes.
Very near to it. So it's not like they can ignore the fact that they are an official Superfund site and they clearly are contaminating. Now, whether it's from PFAS or from other contaminants, I don't know, but it's a little hard for them to deny that.
Yeah, I mentioned that they had largely cleaned up the PCBs and volatile organics that that led to the listing of the site as a Superfund site, but they've had to reopen the site, and they're doing a remedial assessment. So they've sort of back to square one because of PFAS. So there will be.
Okay. Sorry, I had to join a little bit late. I had a student event earlier, so I missed that comment. But yeah, we'd be happy to do that if we can arrange a time that it's possible for us to get there.
Bob, would you be the point person for that, or Dean, Betsy? Who would we follow up with?
I'm happy to be the point. I've so far loved working with Anna the most. We've been working together, and Natalie and the team, so happy to join that. And then Lucy, who is our brand new outreach coordinator, will be involved, but since she is brand new, I can be the direct conduit and work with others to set that up.
Okay, well, great. So we can look forward. Our goal is to actually try to build out the schedule of monthly meetings for these Environmental Justice Partnership Board meetings, and think of it as an opportunity to rotate attention as there might be an event, a kind of an unfolding of decision-making potentially, you know, that might be opportune. So I think we don't have anything booked going into the spring. I think we're with the Curtis Bay meeting in December. I think we're looking at the new year. So it would be good if we could think about, you know, what would be the appropriate time for us to try to convene with the community and what we would want to pull together for that. Okay, so that's the Andrews Air Force. Anything on the coal ash? I think we just want to make sure we're making connections and creating opportunities for. Is there anything, questions or thoughts on that?
I think that we could have a great community meeting. Fred Tutman and the Patuxent River butt up against ours in the same area where many of you've got Chalk Point and the Morgantown and the Faulkner landfill and the Brandywine, and they're all owned by Genon. So I think having maybe a joint meeting with the Potomac and Patuxent and the Charm Center, and we're going to have to pick which is the most strategic community for that. But I think that would be really helpful as well. I think a lot of the folks who live there just aren't aware of all of the exposure risk that is going on and all of the problems. I think there's frustration there with how they've been treated, but I don't think they are armed with all of the information that would help them really demand more attention and action.
Okay, that's great. And Fred's wonderful, longtime friend. Elaine Chioso is the Haw Riverkeeper in North Carolina. I knew her really well too. Okay, great. Anything else we might want to just get on our radar for a few? These sound like 2 action items for upcoming convenings of the EJ Partnership Board, strategically around those issues with those communities.
So I put in the chat this new opportunity for these environmental justice grants, community focused grants at EPA. You're probably aware of them. But I didn't know if there was something that we wanted to talk about with respect to developing a proposal together on any of these issues. This is just a new opportunity. It's just this week. I think it's the first deadline is maybe a month or so. I mean, it's for the next year, I think.
Yeah,
that sounds great.
It's a rolling, sounds like it's a rolling.
It's an announcement, so it'll be multiple submission dates.
Yeah.
No, that go ahead, Anna. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. It sounds like it's rolling submissions all up until December of next year.
Okay, good. Well, on that is exactly an example, Nancy, of what we want to try to help create teams, create partnerships where we could go for grants, but also we shouldn't overlook the fact that the Charm Center also has an annual cycle for pilot grants. So I know maybe Anna, Natalie, Betsy, but we should also try to think of ways that we can come together around building strategic pilot grants for Charm. That's one of the things. Besides meeting and connecting and convening, we do have this annual opportunity for community partnership, community-driven proposals to come in the door to sort of seed pilot data.
And I'm working with your team on that right now, which is fantastic. And I would be a terrible Riverkeeper representative if I failed to invite you out on the water with us. So we have canoes, kayaks, motorized boats. Seeing some of these issues, we can get you access to some of these places that you might not have seen other ways. We actually have a tiny fleet of drones, and Brent actually teaches classes on how to fly drones and how to use the FAA regulations. So the ability to let you actually see some of these things firsthand, we can definitely help with.
But you might want to wait till the weather's better.
Yes.
Not in the middle of December, probably.
No. Yes. Let's aim for late spring for getting out on the water for sure.
Okay. Well, maybe let's follow up on that and think of the right timing for the monthly meetings to convene. And boy, I would love to get out. That sounds wonderful. We could even get our students involved in marshalling.
So we have our environmental engineering undergrads. They have to do a design environmental engineering project in the spring of every year. And they have done some of these. Their focus has been mainly on water. So
fantastic.
Something that could be a doable project for them. It might
you can find lots of stuff. I guarantee it.
Okay.
Great.
Sounds good.
Well, I'll just leave one more opportunity for people to just share thoughts, but I just can't thank you enough for taking the time to orient us to this impressive body of work and laying out the issues in a menu format. And I really look forward to CHARM being able to help facilitate more connections around each of these issues moving forward.
Thank you very much. Very, very good meeting. It was a great discussion. Thanks so much.
And
Look
thank
forward
you
to-
for the opportunity. I think this Charm Center is just fantastic and just desperately needed, and really helps fill some of the gaps that we've had.
We appreciate that, and we look forward to working with you on many different avenues.
Yeah. One parting thought is that, every year, all of the centers like this do get together. And so at some point, as we build our partnerships, it struck me that we were in Houston, Marcia. There was a Superfund site where people were fishing, and the sign giving the public notice was so faded, no one could read it, that the fish were contaminated, and there were people fishing right there. So I think these centers are a neat opportunity where, if you know of instances like that, we might be able to shine a light more nationally also.
Yeah. Well, Chris, just to bring that up, and Chris knows, the rest of the team knows that we have been asked to host the next year's meeting. And one of the things that, at least the meeting we went to last month, was it last month or October? It's recent. They took us around to the various sites in Houston, which you can imagine there are many toxic sites, and showed the entire national community of centers like this, certain sites. And so maybe we could strategize, filling them in, showing them some of the issues that we're dealing with. But I hadn't told this group that we have to accept that invitation. Let me put it that way. It's not really a choice. Okay.
Right.
So we'll be needing to start thinking about the makeup of that meeting soon. So there may be an opportunity for you to have a larger stage, is what Chris is trying to say.
Yeah.
Excellent. And
we kind of centers all around the country. I think there's 10, at least 10.
Yeah. Harvard to Seattle, Washington to Deep South, Gulf Coast, all over. Yeah.
It's fantastic. And we can help with any sites, and again, canoes, kayaks, and boats.
Oh, that would be cool. Take them all out on the water. Yeah.
Well, we really appreciate it. And thanks to Maddie, Honor Roll, everybody who's helped with all the logistics and the coordination on this. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank
Nice
you.
to meet all of you.
Thanks for having us.
Yep. Have a great evening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Talk to you all later. Bye.
Great conversation.
Thanks for all the information, Betsy and Dean.
Thanks, Anna.